So 2025 was a terrible year for cinema, and we're now kicking off 2026 with 28 years later, the Bone Temple. 28 years later was a good film. It was an impressive contribution to British cinema. It had bold and experimental filmmaking in which you're not really used to seeing from British cinema, but it was a good film. You're not used to seeing that in a big release from this nation, and of course, at the end of that film, it teased the sequel as we were introduced to a gang who were all dressed up as Jimmy Savile, and they took the young boy called Spike under their wings. And this was a entry into provocative waters that I think surprised a lot of people, and I was all there for it. I'm a big fan of provocation, but in another sense, it was quite frustrating seeing cinema embrace that terrain, as of course we've been living through a time where a lot of consumers have bashed artists for exploring controversial terrain, and they seem to be okay with this one, but I guess that's in their nature to pick and choose what fits their acceptable criteria. But hey, never mind. But I was looking forward to this film because Alex Garland and Danny Boyle said that this sequel would explore the nature of evil, and it doesn't focus on the infected, but rather the evil committed by the human survivors. I wouldn't be surprised if The Last of Us Part 2 played an influence into this film. Screenwriter Alex Garland is a big fan of the video game, and that game does focus on the humans rather than the infected. And this film does the same. The film focuses on the infected much less so than the first one, definitely. This is all focused on the capacity of humans to commit evil acts. So why did Alex Garland choose the identity of Jimmy Savile to explore this terrain? Well, in an interview that I read last year, I remember him saying that we cherry pick the things we like about the past, but seem to forget about the things that weren't so good. And he says that we're living in a time where we misremember the past. And I guess you could say that Jimmy Savile is a suitable candidate to resemble this, as Savile's crimes were unknown to the public before the rage broke out in 2002. So he still had the reputation as being a national treasure. But of course, behind closed doors, that wasn't quite the case at all. So when Alex Garland was growing up, he talks about how he remembers living in a society where we were progressing and looking forwards towards the future. But now he argues that we're living in a time where we're regressing. And he also makes the point that cult leaders or demagogues may use elements of the past as part of their identity to influence or manipulate their followers. And this is seen through the character Jimmy Crystal, who is played by Jack O'Connell, who is the leader of this gang of Jimmys. And in the opening of the film, there's this brutal scene where Spike is ordered to fight another gang member with a knife. And although it's early on, I wouldn't want to ruin it for you because I think it delivers good shock factor for some. But It demonstrates the cruelty and evil that this group are capable of, and it just gets worse throughout the film. The violence in this film is very reminiscent of the lengths it would go to in films that were part of the New French Extremity movement. And this was great to see because this was filmmaking that wasn't too timid to go into these disturbing areas. And the indifference and lack of empathy towards the victims of this group as they commit these harrowing acts was disturbing, and it did a good job at demonstrating the nature of evil, which is of course this film's central subject. And it does so in a smart and intelligent way. But while all of this is going on, we're also reunited with the lone doctor from 28 years later, who's played by Ralph Fiennes. He takes a deep interest in the alpha zombie who we were introduced to in the first film, who had a massive penis and tore its victims to shreds. It was by far the most violent form of infected that we've been introduced to. And he supplies this alpha zombie with morphine as a form of experimentation. But it ends up turning into this amusing relationship the pair have. But of course, the experimentation that's going on here, there's a purpose to it. And again, you'll have to find out for yourselves where that leads to exactly. But I think many of you will find this particular story direction amusing. But at a certain point, these two story strands, one being governed by the Jimmies and the other one being governed by the lone doctor, they end up meeting in a deeply interesting way, which continues the film's central theme, that being the nature of evil. And the direction in which this goes is satisfying because at the heart of it, the film is intellectual and philosophical, much more so than the first film ever was. In fact, this is the most interesting film out of the whole series because of that element. Another element that I really admired about this film is that the overall tone feels as though it's a spin-off rather than a sequel. It doesn't feel as though the plot naturally follows the events of the first film. It feels like an entirely separate story that exists within the same story world, despite the same characters returning. And it felt bold. And the first film was bold, but that was because of its filmmaking, whereas with this, it's bold because of its narrative direction. British cinema is interesting, again, but despite Alex Garland's gripes about nostalgia, there is a feeling of satisfying nostalgia in this film for the horror we saw in the 2000s. It felt as though we were witnessing the kind of horror we saw in films such as Hostel or Wolf Creek, where the violence was visceral. Now, some of you may be wondering, is the film political, given what was discussed earlier? And to a certain extent, it is. I mean, that element's more on the nose during the film's surprise ending. The cinema screen I was in, there was gasps from the audience, not because of the politics, but because of the surprise. And it didn't make me gasp, but you can go see the film for yourself and figure out if that's a surprise that satisfies you. But going back to the politics element, if you're sensitive to that kind of stuff being shoehorned in these kind of films, it's not a severe case, and it certainly shouldn't take away from this film's strengths. And the main takeaway of all this is a great start to 2026, and that shouldn't be underestimated.